I want to welcome my panelists for this, what promises to be a very lively discussion. Dr. Mike Devoy, Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer for Bayer AG. Dr. Karen DeSalvo, Chief Health Officer for Google Health. And Dr. Keith Dreyer, Chief Data Science Officer for Mass General. Since we have the AI experts here gathered, I wanted to ask you, I thought we would start the discussion by starting with a wish list from each of you. With the understanding that you have of AI and what its potential is, what it's capable of doing, I'd love to just run down the line and get from each of you a wish list of where you feel AI strategies can best be used when we look at something like responding to COVID-19. And Keith, let's start with you.
Sure. So if you think about what AI does today, it's very typically narrow AI to be successful. And so that means that there's a tremendous amount of data that's very consistently structured to solve a specific problem. And if you take COVID as an example, a new disease that we're discovering the symptoms for and discovering the treatments for, and watching hundreds of thousands of people become afflicted with this, the key is to capture as much information as you can in a consistent way, and then start to look for things like how to potentially prevent the disease by social distancing, how to be able to determine if someone has the disease by looking at symptoms that are actually evolving, and then also how to be able to monitor that patient through the care process and even kind of prognose what it is that's going to happen to that patient specifically with the aggregated amount of data from before. So I would say monitoring all the way through, and as you watch these peaks go from start to finish and start to come up again, that's when we start to address other areas like contact tracing like we're doing today. So we're really kind of following through the saga of the disease, and there's many ways that AI can apply to this because of all the data.
And Mike, I'd like to hear from you where you feel, where you would like to see AI really show its muscle.
So I described to all the areas that Keith referred to, and probably add just one from my direction, which is when we have this novel disease, how can we quickly look at treatments we have for other diseases? How can we repurpose drugs in our armamentarium, because they will come much sooner than developing drugs anew from scratch. So really, that if I would add one to Keith's list, it's repurposing and using AI to predict which drugs we might bring into studies as quickly as possible.
Really important, I think, as we move on into the summer and the fall. Karen, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Well, they've got a good list running. I'll add two things. So one, consumer facing, which has been our priority at Google, which is to make sure that people have the right information at the right time that they need about COVID, so they can take the actions to respond to social distancing or wash their hands or take care of their mental health. These are our ways that the consumer, that the community engages with the scientific and public health community. So we believe that saves a lot of lives, and it's been a priority. I would put it on the other end, supports for vaccine development and vaccine deployment. I think there's going to be a huge lift for the world to see that we can do this in a very short-term way, at warp speed, as the FDA says, but also do it in a way that drives equity across the world. So this will take the best tools we have, and I think AI can help us really understand what's going to be the best deployment for vaccines. So consumers and vaccines add nicely, I think, to their list of other countermeasures and what we need to do for public health and the healthcare system.
Well, you mentioned, as you said, a very important aspect of this, which is the consumer-facing one, and it'll become much more urgent, even as we speak, as states are starting to reopen, communities are starting to reopen. Tell us a little bit about the ways that AI can help with, I think, first and foremost on most people's minds right now is hotspots. How do we predict where we might be seeing an uptick in cases and potentially where we might have to reinstitute stricter social distancing and isolation policies as people start to come out and mingle and try to go about their normal lives? What are some of the ways that Google Health is looking at, and even if it's not already implemented, that we should perhaps have in place so that we can have a better handle on this whole reopening process?
Yeah, Alice, my background's in medicine and in public health, and I have to be honest, I never thought in my lifetime that public health would be on the front page of every newspaper, and people would be so informed about the strategies and tools that we use in interrupting the spread of infectious disease. So this is a great time, not only for the community to be aware and learn about how they can engage in social distancing, but I think also to help us create a 21st century set of tools for 21st century challenges like COVID. This is a time when public health needs every tool that at our disposal, including leveraging big data and AI where appropriate. A couple of things that I would spotlight that we've been leaning in on at Google. One is to use information like we have in our busyness reports around when restaurants are busy, that same kind of data to understand when community areas are busy, like parks and playgrounds, or retail or transportation, as a way of tracking in an evidence-based way whether social distancing policies are being adhered to in communities across the world. Those are live in more than 130 countries and can drill down into the county level in the US, for example. So it is a real-time way, or as close to real-time as we feel that privacy promoting allows for public health and for community folks to be able to look and see, are we really doing everything we can to interrupt the spread of disease by distancing, which reduces the R naught below 1. So the community mobility reports is one way we've been leveraging our big data around the world. The other is this effort you mentioned that we've partnered with Apple on. We were asked by a lot of public health folks how we could help with contact tracing, which is this pathway of, in this long tail of the post-peak period, this way that public health needs to identify new cases, isolate them, and do contact tracing to identify folks who might have been at risk, who were exposed to that new case. We want to eliminate outbreaks. And by leveraging BLE, Bluetooth Low Energy, we're able to provide some exposure notification information for public health. It's only available for public health to use as part of the toolbox to have a more modern contact tracing approach, which is going to be essential in this next period and go on for many months.
Okay, and Karen, I'm going to come back to you because I want to explore some of the issues that have been raised about, where we gather that data. But Keith, I wanted to come to you to ask you about, with your expertise in radiology, it's where really AI cut its teeth, so to speak. Can you draw any parallels between how we've applied AI successfully in sort of image capture and pulling data from images to the public health example? And is public health trying to either predict hotspots or monitor patients, look for symptoms, and even detect new ones? Is that a good fertile ground for where AI can live in coming years and decades?
Oh yeah, I think there's no doubt. So to your point about the analogy to successes in AI to date, and imaging is one of those. You look at how it worked and where it worked and what made it work. So what made it work is being very targeted. So asking yourself, if I could make this AI work, would it solve a problem? And with COVID, the challenge is the problem changing so fast that that's not going to be the problem, and I should skate to where the puck is going to be, and what does that look like? So in imaging, we've really focused on those gnarly problems that have existed for a long time, and we've uncovered ways to use data to be able to be almost equivalent to humans in a lot of those cases, which really flattens a lot of the disparities that used to exist. So with COVID, the challenge is, like say, contact tracing. If you're testing at home, it's much different than if you're testing at the ER. If you're testing everyone, it's much different than if you're testing 1 in 1,000. And also, I think the unique thing here is that the data exists in this public-private interchange, right? In the United States, at least. A lot of countries say we're going to put this data here and we're going to solve this data this way. So the really interesting challenge, and I find it very fascinating how we're going about this compared to other countries. And even to Karen's point about the contract tracing component, watching these hotspots and changes in different policies in 50 states, it's almost like doing 50 experiments to find out which ones are going to work well and which ones are not going to work well. And that's really just perfectly amenable to AI. The challenge is, as we've seen, it's hard to embrace all the data from around the world because the data looks different, because treatments are different, because applications of care are different, and even presentations and ways to measure the effective change of therapies are different. So that's one of the big challenges that I see, is that noisy data for AI.
Speaking of noisy data, Mike, I wanted to talk to you about what you brought up, which is repurposing drugs potentially to see if any might have any utility against COVID-19. And here it seems that AI might be ideal, right? Because we have no idea. We, at this point, are going in agnostic about the mechanisms, about what might work, what doesn't work. Tell me a little bit about the process, and also when it comes to the data, whether it makes sense to start looking at sort of universal libraries of compounds where we might have a better chance of finding something that works, rather than having these sort of independent silos of independent libraries and sort of digging around in each one of those. So let's address first whether, how AI makes sense when you're looking at trying to repurpose or find a new drug. And secondly, how we might improve that whole process so that it becomes much more efficient.
I think AI here gives us the opportunity, because we're in a situation where we have to move at such speed. We had a new disease on our hands. So how do we bring the knowledge in terms of the biology of the virus, which at least we understood the genome very quickly, that was public. We understood, therefore, the protein structures, and we had a lot of information around established drugs and products either in development or already long in the market. The point you bring up, and I think that's been one very positive experience we've had during this crisis, is the willingness for sharing, collaboration between all the different stakeholders. So what I saw happen at speed that was very impressive is the companies with technology in AI approached pharmaceutical companies, approached academic groups. There was complete willingness to share data, enter either into public-private partnerships or partner with academic groups, which allowed us to move at speed. At the moment, that's not led to the magic bullet, but I think has really brought us forward in understanding particular treatments we might want to study more, we might want to make more efforts in terms of putting into clinical trials. So I think it's the scale of what AI can do, this potential speed. But I think what's been the difference here is the openness and the willingness of all players to really say, we have such a crisis on our hand, we really have to break down the walls and barriers that we've had before and move at more speed, take more risk in terms of willingness to share, willingness to learn from each other.
And that's a really important point, but I wonder how much of that is really driven by, as you said, the emergency, the urgency of the need. How hopeful are you that such collaborations and such sort of spirit of working together will continue? Because we hear often about, especially in the therapeutics and even in vaccine development, how the urgency of a situation will really drive a lot of innovation, a lot of activity, a lot of research, and a lot of development. And yet when the cases start to wane, inevitably interest starts to wane. So how confident are you that those partnerships, that collaboration you're seeing, will be sustained?
I'm an optimist, but I also think it's really vital that we capture the good things we've learned from this crisis. I mean, I've seen how we've changed our ways of working. We're holding this, last year I flew to Boston. This time we're doing the meeting virtually. We've seen an increased ability to engage virtually, to contact virtually, people to, as I say, partner, move at speed because of what we face. And I think we're all learning the benefits of that, not just for solving the problems we face here and now with the crisis, but also how it can enhance our ability to move forward new treatments, learn from each other. Undoubtedly, as we move through this crisis, there may be some stepping back, but we also see this is not the last pandemic the world will face. So I think we really need to make sure we're learning here and nurturing those collaborations and not slipping back, because that, as you said, Karen, is certainly where we've lost ground already in this facing this crisis because we've maybe not taken as well as we should have done as a world some of the lessons we could have picked up and implemented sooner.
Right. And Karen, so Mike, you just discussed sort of the corporate level challenges there. Karen, on the individual level, of course, no AI algorithm can be done, or it's only as good. Any algorithm is only as good as the data on which it's based. When it comes to collecting data, tell me a little bit about the process right now for where we're getting data to better understand, let's say, potential hotspots, or to be able to track, contact trace and track where new infections might come from. How good is that data, and how willing are people to give up potentially some privacy concerns they might have in order to create a database or create an algorithm that's really going to give us some meat as far as being able to do something about the pandemic?
You know, when I started my job here a few months ago as the Chief Health Officer at Google Health, I started by hosting listening sessions with consumers about how tech could be helpful to them. The sessions were, the series of sessions were interrupted by the pandemic, but some of the early things I heard were that consumers wanted transparency and partnership, and they wanted help removing friction in the way that they develop their own health, whether it was through healthcare or sort of a broader frame on what drives health. It's a very similar theme to what I've heard throughout my life, whether it's from my own patients or from when I was in public service in public health, that people really just want to understand what and be able to permission the use of their data. This trust component is important to me. It's important to us, and it was important as we were thinking about how we could support hotspot development. You know, I think for us, it was that we wanted to use a very privacy preserving approach, which means that if we could not use location, which is noisy and not really the best source of data, honestly, but rather leverage BLE as a tool to know when people had come into close contact or one phone with another, and use a set of encryption keys that would keep that data private, rotate those often to protect people just in case, and then make the information accessible only to public health. We did this with Apple. Speaking of, partnerships that develop in pandemics, a competitor, but we knew that if the two operating systems together were using the same interoperable API and the same operating system technology, that we could reach much more people in the world, and that would be better information, more information for public health. We are still like so much of the other data that we've been describing today, we're literally in the middle of this pandemic. We're building our wings after we've all jumped off the cliff, as we used to say a lot after Hurricane Katrina. And so we are learning with public health how these tools, this exposure notification set of tools that we've been developing with Apple, how to co-create that with public health so it's most useful to them as one of the tools in the toolbox to support digital contact tracing, this sort of 21st century approach. But it's got to be privacy preserving, and it's got to be done in a way that really puts trust and people first. So that's been a core principle for us.
And Keith, I'd love to get your perspective too on this issue of privacy and what you've seen from the applications of AI so far as in the imaging area. How open are people to having their data become part of something larger like an AI algorithm?
Well, I think it's, let's say a couple of things. One, I think it's mixed. I agree with Karen that I find that patients, if they understand what it is you're doing, you're not nefarious, and you have good intentions, that people will typically comply. They should have an option to opt out. But I would say that it's not been very clean across the board. So all companies that generate AI over the last 5 years have not done it for the same reason. And all it takes is one bad apple, and everyone gets worried about what's going to happen to their data. What's the purpose of this company? What are they doing with my data? In this country, at least, the healthcare providers are typically the stewards of that data. And so we've taken on this tremendous responsibility to make sure that we do that on the best interest of our patients, regardless of what they've signed, and if they've signed away their rights, how do we work with them on in their best interest? What I'd see that's changed with COVID is, as we've said, these relationships now are forming faster. We're all doing this for the common good. Typically, everything is open source and made available, so there's no profitability question of conflicts of interest, and that typically goes away. But it doesn't mean that we've taken away the privacy issues. So now this responsibility for privacy is falling on different groups than it used to before. We can't claim, well, HIPAA says this or that. We're moving faster than these things. So now we have to have governance and ethics groups put together so we make sure that we're doing the right thing and make it very transparent. And I think that at the end of this, hopefully some of that control shifts places, but it also does it in a much more responsible way. And I think each country is going to have a different experience with this and have a different decision at the end of it as to what part worked and what part didn't work.
And unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time for this session, but I wanted to give each of you one or two sentences to wrap us up and let us know if you're looking 5-10 years down the road, what application of AI do you hope to see when it comes to, our responding to an outbreak like COVID-19? Mike, let's start with you.
Thanks, Alice. So I think if it was one thing, it would be earlier prediction and warnings of these things so we can step in and act before we end up in the situation we now find ourselves in as a world.
Karen?
It would be that we've been intentional in our development of AI so that we eliminate disparities and don't aggravate them.
Okay, and Keith?
And say that we continuously trying to abstract this problem above just COVID and above just the pandemic of 2020 and say, what are the things that if this happens again, what different shapes and way can it present itself so that we can have the appropriate data so we can kind of track this, as Michael was saying, ahead of time to see where it's spreading. There's a lot of boundary challenges, data ownership challenges that need to be overcome, but those should be discussed and exposed.
Thank you, Mike, Karen, and Keith, for your thoughts on what will certainly become a very important technology as we start reopening our communities this summer and this fall.